Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for what I hope to be two very engaged days of conversation. My name is Theodore and I have the pleasure of just giving a very brief introduction for what we call our Phase 2 thesis reviews. This is a journey of 16 months for the students here, and we've always, I think, very much welcomed having a really engaged discussion about what architecture can be. Design Research Lab now is almost 3 decades old, and in the history of the digital and the computational, that's an eternity in a sense. And the way that the program is always organized has always been about offering a kind of speculative question, a research agenda that we usually work over 3 or 4 years in a very horizontal manner, with the students kind of exploring a lot of issues, from prototyping to computation, from thinking about new tools for architecture to thinking about how architecture can participate in a lot of the ongoing issues in the world. What you'll see over the next 2 days is research that's basically been working on a whole series of issues that we've thematized around social ecologies, looking at strategies of parametric design, generative design, looking at the issues of gamification and mobility, exploring ideas of, the elemental and other kinds of issues. And each of the projects, in a sense, is going to set the stage for their own kind of engagement within this, which is really a response to 4 studios that we have running. With Pierre Andrea and his team, they've been working on issues around mobility, climate shifts, responsiveness, and soft infrastructures. I think this is the 3rd or 4th cycle. Pierre has been looking at the issue of mobility, trying to challenge the issues of the fixed and the finite, and exploring what that actually could mean in terms of sustaining life in this sense. Shajay, Bhooshan and his team has been looking at what he's calling architectural intelligence for new cities. It's looking at settlement design, it's looking at the issues of gamification and engagement with different kinds of participants, exploring the notion of the city, primarily London-based. Patrick Schumacher has been working with his team on issues around the metaverse, in particular this year, refactoring a concept of the virtual Bauhaus as the 21st century social learning space, using kind of challenges to UX design, the way that we kind of communicate online, and exploring that within, I think, the discourse of parametricism, tectonism, and so forth. And my own studio, which I run with my team, called Elemental, which is looking really at phenomenon as a form of technology, trying to sustain life by looking at issues of ecology and, in a sense, challenging kind of certain notions of sustainability. We are very fortunate that we have a very distinguished group of critics. And to be honest, if I stood here trying to explain all of their accolades, it would be a pretty long introduction. So I want to encourage everybody to look at the DRL website, which is drl.aaschool.ac.uk. We did a mini site for the event, which has all of our critics that are joining us over the 2 days, but also the schedule for the day, and also the students' kind of abstracts and some sample of the work that you'll be seeing. Along with that, for all of those that are joining us online, the live stream is through YouTube, and you'll find the access to those live streams on the mini site as well. So without further ado, the schedule for today will be 3 teams, basically an hour each. They have 20 minutes for presentation, and basically we have a half hour for discussion, and then we swap over and we do it again. We'll take a break, we'll do another 3 teams, and we'll conclude today, do it again tomorrow, but then conclude with a very special keynote from someone who's very dear to us, Marta Malay Alamani. So with that, I welcome the first team.
Good morning, everyone. We are Team IntenCity from Studio Bhooshan. I'm Arfeen with my teammates Krithika and Maddona. As the demand for the new cities grows and existing urban areas become increasingly dense, there is a pressing need for low-risk environments to facilitate rapid urban experimentation. Our studio explores the development of virtual sandboxes, dynamic testing grounds for innovative urban designs. These digital platforms enables the refinement of architectural components, paving the way for swift and efficient physical implementation in real-world setting. Our thesis explores how urban intensification can enable a sustainable increase in urban populations, contributing to healthier and more vibrant communities. A significant population increase is anticipated, with projections indicating that 68% of the world's population will reside in urban area by 2040. Bill and Melinda Gates Bill and Melinda Gates emphasized in their foundation's annual letter in 2019 that we need to build one New York every month for the next 40 years to accommodate the growing urban population. But focusing on New York, Manhattan boasts one of the highest population densities in the world, with over 70,000 residents per square mile. In contrast, Staten Island, located just 40 kilometers away and well connected, has a significantly lower population density of only 8,000 people per square mile. Herein lies our unexplored Pandora of potential. Suburbs have attractive qualities like low cost of land, while they enhance connectivity to urban centers, making it easier for residents to access jobs and amenities.
Like light rail lines.
Our thesis aims to capitalize on the various benefits suburbs has to offer. We propose a growth model centered to transit-oriented development, transforming suburbs into vibrant, multifunctional urban districts. This approach not only enhances accessibility, but also fosters economic vitality and community engagement, paving the way for sustainable urban living. Taking a look at Croydon, a suburb in London with over 8,000 hectares and merely 1,700 people per square kilometre, shows unequitable distribution of resources, which with a little planning can be our best asset. We intend to propose models focusing on intensification, which will have co-location of work, visit and live for mixed use, which allows us to use alternate mode of transport. Our Croydon model refers to area which inefficiently utilized land and other built infrastructure. There are over 18 Croydons in London alone. This begs the question, how many such might there be in the entire world? We approached our thesis through two primary lenses, urbanism and architecture, emphasizing a bottom-up emergent strategy that prioritizes community engagement and organized development.
The research methodology consisted of three notable phases: design research, urban intelligence, and architectural design. In our first phase, we studied at the scales of city, district, neighborhood, and the street level so as to be able to identify and benchmark our objectives for the thesis. Vancouver successfully implemented high-density development while maintaining quality of life. We learned of co-location of work, live, and recreational functions within the boundaries of a neighborhood, creating vibrant environments. At the district level, our studies of neighborhoods and districts to maximize social interactions among residents yielded valuable insights from case studies of Poblana in Barcelona and high-density neighborhoods like Choi Hong Estate in Hong Kong, like using public spaces as social catalysts. Both case studies highlight their design that prioritizes walkability and public settings that serve as forum for association and social interaction beyond home and work. At the street level, we studied cities at the street level like La Ramblas revealed that the crucial importance of human scale experiences, offering a first-person perspective that shaped our understanding of how urban spaces are perceived, which we then later tried to use as a method of evaluation in our later studies. City Skylines utilizes an agent-based modeling to create a realistic urban simulation. Each citizen in the game is an individual agent with unique behavior and decision-making processes. This allows for a more accurate representation of how people interact with their environment and make choices within the city. We studied the game for its urban dynamics, like happiness index, traffic index, and land value, as one of our key takeaways was its demand-based land allocation system. As residential zones populate, demand for commercial area increases. When commercial zones fill up, industrial demand rises to provide jobs and goods. This system maintains a triangular balance between residential, commercial, and industrial zones. Each zone type influences the demand for others, which we try to replicate in our own urban system.
Here we are looking into contextual details of Croydon, of about how many train stations do we have there and how many trains per day they are connected from Croydon to central London. As you can see that it's just 30 to 40 minutes away by train. So this is how we started looking forward into intensifying Croydon, which is one by one transit hub, and then later growing it into throughout the Croydon, which is 87.2 square kilometers. Here you can see how the time-based growth can affect the intensification of Croydon. It starts from the very basic of 800-meter radii near the transit hub, which is 10 to 12 minutes of walking distance, hence increasing more walkability throughout the London borough of Croydon. We started first with the Reedham station in Pule. Here's our workflow for how we can achieve intensification through different optimization methods. We can try to optimize the greens and the pedestrian network as well as the vehicular network, ultimately combining the whole three approaches into a new urban model for Croydon. The three different approaches, which are the green space distribution and pedestrian network and road network, initially we start with connecting it with the outer existing road connections to give us the whole new network, and the green spaces can be equally divided from north to south direction and from east to west as well. In the pedestrian network, we try to connect the existing road junctions throughout the place so that they can connect and form a new pedestrian network, except not just the vehicular, which is currently existing there. And in the road network, we try two different approaches. One is taking train line as the separating factor of the two zones, and one which is connecting the two zones and not affected by the train line. This is how the green spaces could be divided as well as the pedestrian network, and a grid deformation can help us in the road networks. Here are some urban morphologies, massing and the scalar heights of how we can also play with the gradient of the buildings, which could be a leading factor for people who are living there and walking throughout the area. They could locate the high-rise buildings, as we are trying to place the high-rise buildings near the transit hub. So if they are in the outer areas, and they could follow the language of the city through these urban morphologies. These are the height maps calculating and analyzing how it could be functional. And ultimately, a combined approach which is trying to not only emphasize the top-down approach, which is urban morphology model, but also appreciating the fact that development happens in a bottom-up approach by year by year, building by buildings. Here it shows a custom code scripting for the transit hub, how it can start from one patch and then another and covering the whole area, not just in a 1 year or 2 year development, but throughout the 50 years development. Using the custom scripting, we achieved plots and the new road network, which values the pedestrian network more than the vehicular network, and equally dividing the green spaces throughout the fabric. And it gives a new language to the Croydon, and also accepts and appreciates some existing road networks, because these are currently they have more footfall throughout the daytime, so we are considering all those factors in this part. These are some studies done on the model. And then we try to achieve an urban model using the gamification method, which not only shows us how each building will function, or if each building will be just of one function, but through time it can grow horizontally as well as vertically, floor by floor, and not the just one function has to be there in one building. Here are some game rules as presets we try to give in our gamification process. The contextual rules, which are residential, industrial, commercial, office, and public players. The value of land will be affected by these players as they will come along it. If a residential player comes, another residential players' land value will be increased by 5 times, and so on for the public, 4 times, office 2, commercial 3, and industrial will have a repulsive force as a general factor. Another set of rules are global rules, which are TLPR, which is train line, landscape, and roads, and public, which is current existing site conditions and how they're affecting the land value for each parcel and each building. The behavior of the game is it provides user interface, and the user can choose what kind of cell typology user wants to build, and what kind of shape of the building, what kind of function of the building, in which zone and on which height and how many levels. So we are trying to combine all those factors which are currently existing in real world development, and how each building can affect the other building because of their land use. Here's the first node development we try to achieve through gamification method, where you can see that first the transit hub comes, which is trying to accommodate 800 people and 400 apartments. And how nearby that transit hub with each node development is increasing patch by patch, and it's not just growing horizontally, but it is also growing vertically. And the ultimate result of this model is to see how each land use affects the function, affects the land value, as well as affects the height map analysis. In the left-hand side, you can see that the points are also increased in RICOP, and we are also calculating the density of how many people will be living here, and in how much hectares. The ideal goal is to achieve 100 dwellings per hectare, which is currently 9 dwellings in Croydon, and it is quite low comparative to central London. So through all these iterations, we finally achieved one urban model which has achieved 60,000 people per hectare and 100 dwellings per hectare, and it's a complete mixed-use fabric developed throughout the 50 years, considering the existing factors too. Here we are looking into how we can detail out and develop the transit hub first, where the initial growth starts. Ideally, the development will start from the transit hub. So you can see the train line is highlighted here, and then we have proposed ring road around the 200 meters. So all these zones are connected to the main mega structure which we are trying to propose here. The existing station shortcomings are they have narrow platforms and the lack of interactive spaces, poor connectivity, inadequate supporting infrastructure, and it's not like that. The footfall is less. The footfall is high there. It's 117 trains, for God's sake. And then we have transit hub goals we are trying to achieve, which is improve passenger experience and safety, enhance street level pedestrian experience, improve access to nearby neighborhood and business, a mixed use typology, and all those things which make the area more vibrant and more livable and walkable in terms of quality of life. As the initial sketch of a transit hub building, and then these are some views, and we are trying to achieve an aerodynamic language for this kind of architecture of the building. In the podium level, it is comprised of commercial hubs, while on the above it there are 400 apartments, and it's a residential tower so that people can easily access and commute between Croydon and the central London. We tried to plan out the layouts for single family and co-living apartments, as well as the multi-family layouts, and ultimately for the detached apartments as well. This shows how the road connectivity of the podium level could be. And we also designed the balcony and the terrace system for the residential tower, which are oriented towards north and east, giving the whole building a complete sunlight access in the morning time, while in south and west it gets merged with the glass facade so that it can incorporate more heat throughout the time, as it's quite cold in this area throughout the year, so we're trying to incorporate heat as much as possible. And in this view you can see that how we are also using the podium level to give some communal spaces and green areas with some water bodies, and underneath there is an existing train line, and then we have connected it through a bridge which is a pedestrian walkway. And this is how we are planning to design our first transit hub in the Croydon. And this shows some green areas nearby and how they are oriented and developed towards transit hub.
At the building level, we begin our studies with shape grammar. Shape grammar provides a rule-based method for generating urban forms, allowing for systemic exploration of intensification strategies. We initiated our iterative process by subdividing plots and assigning volumetric shapes to three major typologies: commercial, residential, and office spaces. Each iteration was meticulously modeled and subjected to a first-person simulation, allowing us to experience the unique strategies from a pedestrian perspective. Each iteration took us to the next one as we worked on the shortcomings and learnings of its predecessor. For example, in this iteration, we tried to make the volumetric split more even and uniform between the three functions. Uniformity kind of led to an isotropic option. As an approach to avoid that, we tried rotating the floor plates so as to achieve uniqueness and placemaking in the neighborhood. Refining it further, we arrived at urban terraces, introducing a system of voids. Urban voids have been reimagined to create meaningful, quality urban spaces that promote human-scale interactions. We tried activating a roofscape in the commercial zone. Expanding public spaces allowed us to explore vertical urbanism through the concept of creating a multi-layered city. We then attempted to interconnect the buildings as a way to promote interaction among residents at the commercial levels. We finally arrive at our rule sets to be applied to the plots and the building levels. Buildings in Zone 1, which is about a 5-minute walking distance from the transit hub, are about 80 to 60 meters in height. They orient towards the transit hub. Residences feature maximum density and maximum void in the zone. As we move farther away, the buildings start to reduce in height, and they also density also starts reducing, and the urban void starts reducing to 35%. We continue seeing towers wane as we move further and further away from the transit hub. In Zone 4, we have the least density and the most openness in terms of plans for residential buildings. Plot sizes in between, designated small, medium, large, and extra large, expand to create elliptical silhouettes of buildings. Together, if there are 2 towers in a plot, then they orient towards the transit hub. Commercial, while low in height, occupies 100% of the ring, while office are given 75% and residences are given 50%. Buildings taper in area as we climb higher. Buildings of the same function attract each other, while different ones repel each other. This allows us to orient openings, buildings, front facades, balconies, etc. Commercial brings together all the buildings by bridging one with one another, creating a network of 3-dimensional spaces. These buildings often double as public arenas, functioning as spaces for social interaction. Moving on to spatial study. Our design methodology at the building level prioritizes human perception and experience as the fundamental driver of urban space creation. This approach transcends traditional architectural practices by placing human interaction at the core of the spatial design. Our design approach for commercial spaces embraces the concept of multi-layered city, utilizing a system of interconnected floor plates linked by ramp and stairs, creating a 3-dimensional network of spaces, blurring boundaries between different levels and functions. Urban terracing allows for efficient use of limited land by creating multi-level structures that maximize living space without expanding the footprint. It allowed us to play with densities across different zones as we move away from the transit hub. The approach to office design was made to complement the thesis by extending the concepts of interactive multi-level spaces from commercial and residential areas to office environments, creating a cohesive urban intensification strategy across all building functions. Here's one of the first views of intensified Croydon.
At the building level, we followed a rule to place commercial at the lowermost, followed by offices, then residences vertically, so as to maintain privacy as well as to create a vibrant ground level. Applying our rule sets across 4 different plot sizes, we arrived at 28 different prototypes of buildings that respond to context and various functional mix as allocated by our 4D allocation system. Here is a closer look at some of those prototypical buildings. As you can see, this is how we converted our land use allocation into our spatial modules and buildings. This is our version of intensified Croydon. And here is one of the render outlooking our transit hub and the building systems. At the end, we would like to have a special thanks to our studio masters, structural consultant AKT2, DPL staff, and Phase 1 helpers. Thank you so much.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay. So here are our urban morphology models where we are trying to achieve different networks in road level, pedestrian level, as well as green level. And this is our game module, which shows the second node development. And it is where the Croydon has been intensified up to its 50% of limit. And you can see how buildings are of different hues, as each color shows a different function, and how they develop in zones. Even the heights of the building develops through a particular variant according to their zone allocations, and starting with the transit hub. First, the transit hub building comes, and the height decreases as we move forward from transit hub, and this shows how on urban level in 4D land use allocation throughout the time, the Croydon module can be intensified.
And here are the few versions of our final shape grammar. And this is the 4D allocation of our shape grammar that comes from our game. And here are the plots, 7 different types that we explained in our PPT. They are the different shape grammars as we move ahead. And this is the final building system of our shape grammar. And this is in our the whole building system applied in the one of our prototypical zone 1. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. A great project, I think, because it embraces from really early concept master plan all the way to the detail of the balcony. I really love that. I love the ambition to embrace the entire built environment. I have a question for you. Over the time span, you're talking about 50 years. 50 years is a long time in architectural time, and we have seen just recently in the last few years how our use of space has changed, how the percentage of space we use for office has diminished and then increased, how residential has grown or diminished. I was wondering if in your long-term planning, is there a way of in time also adjust the percentage of use of space, if it's something that you have considered or your model would be able to support?
Yes, I would like to answer. That's a very interesting question, actually. In our gamification interface and model, so it's where we decide the presets of in which zone how much percentage of land use has to be given. There are particular limits of each zone, that this much percent of residential will be built in zone 1, and then this much percent of office will be built in zone 4, because we are also considering the existing buildings there, existing homes there. So we don't really want to disturb or wipe out the Croydon in one go. So yes, of course, in our game module, we can change the percentage in our interface, and so does the user limits will change throughout the timeline. I hope that was...
Okay, yes. Thank you so much. For your research. Your tutor gave you very clever title, not artificial intelligence, but architectural intelligence. Also, you chose to give your answer with a very actual concept, intensity. So in that field, maybe I'm interesting. You started with intense with infrastructure, and that you move from urbanistic concept to some kind of functional geometry. And I am curious why you choose that circle forms. Did you test it maybe linear forms? Because we know that circle forms or circle geometry are somehow, it is not extrovert. Like at the very beginning with intensity, you want to open everything in the district, in the town, in the infrastructure. But somehow when I saw your models on the level of district, you stay just a little bit introvert in the architectural form, because you at the end didn't connect roads, pedestrians in inner structure of the building? First question, I know the answer, but I want to hear from you what is the reason for that. And the second thing, why you choose to stay just a little bit on 2 dimension in high? Because when we see the first models, you always move from down to the end, but in the last phase we can see just one level in the high.
I think I'll answer your second question first. In terms of height, so the height reduces across zones, and what you see over there is the zone 1. So in the first zone, most of the buildings are between 80 to 60 meters height, and essentially you don't see much difference there. But in the entire urban ones, that you would see a lot of a good gradient of height, which we've detailed out the zone 1. As far as your first question, as to why we went for the circular form, so initially when we started testing out the shape grammar, what we did was the first iteration actually assigned different kinds of shapes to every function, as in like some of the buildings were triangular, some were square. But when we started experiencing it we used Unreal Engine to do a first-person simulation, and when we did that, we realized that it really doesn't matter. When the person walks down the street, they don't really see anything, which is why when we started detailing out our spatial forms, we decided to kind of move around with the floor plates when it came to commercial, which is at the ground level, and that is where most people interact. And we've quite actually, if we can go back to that slide, I think you can see that we've played with the floor plates. We've created a system of ramps, and we've enabled a system where people can be inside and also on top of the roof levels as well, and that provides them a place like a public arena. Yeah, thank you.
I really like your analysis, and I think it's very detailed. I think you've worked for a long time on almost like an urban organism. When it comes to London, I quite like these models where there's a mixture of urban fabric. Like here I can see that there's some typology you can find in London merged with your design, and I thought this was quite successful. I don't particularly like so much the outline you have here. That would be my comment about the integration.
Very interesting project. I mean, I actually think that your project is trying to test some ideas, and perhaps we shouldn't necessarily think of it as a model for Croydon, but only in the sense that you intend to have a Croydon research project. So in that sense, I want to first, 2 questions. One is that why is Croydon supposed to, in your mind, stay as a sort of commuter city? And the reason I see that is because you're still making the train station as the sort of the actual node of high density, meaning automatically everybody who is in Croydon or more people in Croydon are going to want to get elsewhere rather than Croydon itself as a kind of high density city. So in some ways, I am questioning your, let's say, focal attention to the train station as the way in which the form of the city develops and the density, height density, etc., is focused on. The second question is your sectional condition, meaning the relationship between what you consider to be car, green, and public space, and how that affects the form of your buildings. I enjoyed quite your presentation in various aspects. I think there is a lot that you have learned, it seems, from the way in which typologies and forms of buildings, as well as your infrastructure, can intervene in what might have been the original, let's say, subdivisional geometry. So there is a lot of sophistication, and I don't want this to appear unrecognized, but somehow I feel that when I look at your typology of buildings and the ramps going up and eroding, let's say, positively, what might have been the original, let's say, circular or round-shaped buildings, I want to find out what it is that actually erodes that original shape. Meaning, are these kind of pedestrian greens or car? Because you refer to ground or the podium level often, and I'm not sure that in your final case, you're not positively eroding that kind of assumed one podium as the pedestrian formation. So this kind of multi-level podium, if you will, might be actually more interesting only if we say, establish what is the role of the car in relation to this. You might choose to take car out or positively in. It's your choice, but I would like that description, please.
Sorry, guys.
For the cars, technically, yes, every building is accessible by the road and by the vehicle, but our system, in its essence, we began developing it as an 800-meter radius so that it's walkable as well from the transit hub, which is a 10 to 12-minute walk. So all of the buildings are accessible by walk and as well as by car. I think the first question was about why we focus on the transit hub. So it is a time-based growth model that what we're trying to develop here. And in that essence, we think that the transit hub would be the very first node that appears, and that makes it a workable model as well. And I think, yes, in 50 years' time, when Croydon develops, we do intend for it to become its own prototypical, its own urban center. And that's why we're also distributing offices and recreational zones as well. And so that it can be its own urban center instead of being dependent on central London.
Can I add a point too? Also, the idea behind the transit hub development or transit-oriented development was as we understand the existing scenario of Croydon or multiple suburban areas, there are more housing opportunities, and if we intend to develop a residential tower with the transit hub and with all the amenities and the public spaces, I think that's a very good start for an urban area to grow from. That could be the most attractive point. It's easy to commute. It's more giving us more opportunities as we are living in a residential area. So it is taking away that factor as well, but of living in some dense zone. But it is also giving an opportunity to commute as easy as possible. Hence, the idea behind the transit hub developed.
I think it's an amazing piece of work. There's a huge amount of work here, enormous amount of work. And choosing a very difficult piece of London. Croydon is notoriously horrible. Insofar as there's a total disconnection between enormous blocks of government workers, open space, roads, it's dysfunctional. It doesn't connect up properly at all. And my worry about the study is that in a funny way, you're continuing with what's happening there. The model in front of us is like Croydon now. It's entirely different, but the same space between the buildings is the issue. And maybe the most interesting thing about your study is that you create an urban vision, and maybe the most important piece of that vision is the space between the buildings, because you see buildings, space, and transport. And actually the mesotexture of this place, the intermediate, is the most important of all to change. So I think the model might incorporate the notion of the mesotexture. What does it feel like between the buildings? Because I think unless you delve down into that detail, you don't address that issue. And actually much of city life is to do with the mesotexture of the city, whether it's in the City of London or in a more residential area. It's to do with the secondary issues. And Croydon is particularly awful in that direction. So I think one thing which might be added to your study, if you like, and I think you've done a fantastic amount of work, so I congratulate you on presentation, clarity, and simplicity of it from that point of view, positively. I think it may be worth dipping your finger at some point in time and thinking, well, what about the space that isn't designed by the architects or the urbanists or the transport engineers? That may be the most important of all. The pieces of London that are always successful are the pieces of mesotexture. Milan Galleria is not a building, it's not outdoor space, but it's one of the great spaces. Leadenhall Market, Thursday evening, is absolutely roaring, fantastic, full of humanity, life, enjoyment, and it's not a building, and it's not this open space. And that's exactly what Croydon lacks. And I think in the analysis, you've been very brave in your overall analysis, but there's an extra element. It's not buildings, transportation, and open space. It's the mesotexture that glues them all together. But I think it's a great piece of work, well presented, and compared with what we used to do when I was a student here, an enormous scope and vision. Well done.
Well, that's very interesting. I picked up a phrase which I'm going to use from now on, mesotexture. But there's a lot of truth in there. And just to follow on, in your introduction, you looked at a lot of public space, and it's one of the categories. And it were pedestrian zones of engagement, and you focused on this urban furniture and so on and so forth. I would add to this idea of urban space, the way it comes through that's Rob Greer in his book on urban space, building on community city, where the in-between space also has a form, a shape, a recognizability, and instead of being the amorphous leftover, right? So that's this discourse, and it's not sure if it coincides with mesotexture. Maybe mesotexture nests within an urban space. You can probably still install it into this in-between space through secondary elements, but if you start also thematizing the voids as much as the solids. And I think to in your defense, some of this reoccurs on higher level in these garden spaces between the residential and the office spaces, etc., or even within residentials, although you're carving away a lot of the density you want to inject there. But I had some other few more points I wanted to make. I mean, it was not noticed, so you're saying 50 years because you don't want to wipe it all out in one go. But your end result is a full tabula rasa rebuild. So we can see these patches because maybe because it's dramatic, you have the terrace houses, 2-story terrace houses, and these kind of long lines, and in the end we're having a very dense condition. So maybe this zone you've chosen leads to this. Maybe you would have chosen the current center of Croydon, which has all these problems, but and I see it's difficult with these maintaining some of this interlacing, like Hannes was suggesting. He likes existing patterns with new patterns. That's tough because the current pattern is so low density and this kind of, but I still feel there's something kind of dissatisfying with this kind of total erasure, let's say, and in the in-between condition, we're not looking at it enough. You know, it comes up in glimpses where you have this kind of stark contrast of this road with 2-story terrace houses and the tower rising behind it. One more point, a few more points. So the network is interesting. You take this zone and then you intensify circulation through it. with these kind of Pareto-style network conditions. But I think we should have looked at then, at the moment, these patterns look isotropic in the sense that there's equal network density anywhere. Whereas I think thinking with space syntax, if you have so much connectivity potentials, yeah, that's good, you get from here to there in the relatively fast way, there's a kind of less of detour. But it means also potentially that you lack the possibility of concentrating flows to generate urbanity. So it might be sometimes strategically important that you don't connect every point equally to every other point, but to strategically also concentrate and converge flows, and then where the network is differentiated between highly connected and less connected, and even maintaining the cul-de-sac condition. And then allow that to also partly determine the settling of some of those functions. And I think the function color coding gets lost in your all gray, all white models. That means in terms of articulating the typologies, you haven't watched out to make them distinct enough, I feel, and your zoning is always residential, commercial, office, residential in that stack, and not laterally so much. And finally, the circle you're inscribing makes me a bit uncomfortable. Calling a ring road is way too small, but suddenly you have this platonic form. You have this field. You have the network lines. You have a fabric. You want to organically grow, but then you inscribe this platonic circle there, which is a taboo in parametrism, by the way, for good reasons. So there's a kind of taboo violation, which also I think is a strategic mistake. And although I do defend this idea of taking the train station as some kind of organizing hub from which things flow, where you then accumulate commercial, and I mean it's quite traditional, but I do think and it should be legible. And the tower, by the way, whoever designed it, is quite beautiful, but it's maybe too unique. So it's kind of separate out. Okay, you do the tower, we do the city, and it's located right. It deserves this prominence, but I think it's developed too separately. But overall, I think you've very kind of coherent presentation. You go back to your thesis and state how much density you will have achieved. It's kind of reaching nearly New York standards, supposedly. And I think so, yeah, I'm quite happy overall. But these points of criticism, there are quite a few, I think that deserve to be reflected upon. Who? Oh.
I want to just add one perspective, which is more maybe around the tools that you're using and how the tools shape the outcome of what you're doing. Because a lot of the times, I think at this moment in time, first of all, I think it's right what you said, that this is an experiment and this is a piece of research, and we should look at it like that. But I think it would also be important to maybe start to think about what kind of tools we want in the future, because at the moment, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff out there that you have used very well, but it maybe is not quite doing what you want it to do. And for me, the whole point kind of starts going back a bit, to this idea of flexible master planning, where now with those tools, in theory, we have the ability to really clearly articulate what our vision is. We can clearly articulate what our goals are, and you try to do that, but then we can introduce a flexibility where, in a way, you are building an empty shelf, which I would also agree is the open space, and it's the interaction that you talked about, right? And then you define certain you make programmatic decisions, but in reality, over the next 50 years, each of these plots can be negotiated within this framework, right? And so I think my two comments are, one, it maybe makes sense to think about, what's missing at the moment. I think the tools maybe don't emphasize public space enough, or open space, or human interaction, right? They just were developed for different use cases. And so there's a need to kind of add to those tools. And secondly, I think it's more and more important, was never more important, I think, than now, to be very clear about what it is that you are trying to achieve, what's the end, what kind of quality of space you want to create, right? But all in all, I'm super happy to see this work and what you're doing, and I think it's an exciting beginning into a new way of planning. Thank you.
Okay, I think that. Oh, go on. Go ahead. Well, I want to say that a lot of my comments have already been said, and I really I am also very impressed with the amount of work, and I'm actually very interested in in the approach or the methodology of this project, because maybe what I want to say is that this notion of gamification for the development of cities. I know by experience that, for example, the municipality of Rotterdam, as an example, is digitalizing the whole entire city in 3D with all the data, everything. And they do that in order to take decisions. And for example, I wonder if your game, the original approach, if you had, for example, building data that was connected to it, you could establish, for example, which buildings are most likely to be demolished first. Because that would maybe propose a different temporality to your model. And maybe instead of starting in the center and then growing radially, you would see that there is an area of the neighborhood that is most likely to be the first one to go. So I think that it would be very interesting, and I relate to this comment that was made about when things are in between, when things are in the middle. I think that's very interesting because you have a lot of years of that, and it would be interesting to not too quickly go to the tabula rasa version of it. So that said, I think that also your game could potentially learn from the context in which it's applied. Because, for example, you have looked at the urban design development that goes on in Barcelona as an example. And I think that if your game was applied to Barcelona, there would be some contextual rules and some even contextual architectural let's say styles or levels or, that would need to be taken into account precisely because this is not developed from one day to the next. So there is all this transition that maybe when it makes sense with the local architecture, it's actually much more rich than with your own style from day one. And so from that perspective, I wonder if here in London, in that specific district, I don't know it, but I just heard that it's horrible. But maybe there is something contextual there that the game could also learn. And if you thought about it as a learning process of the game itself, then every time that it's applied in a different city, it is learning from that context. Then maybe it would have a lot of information acquired for places where there is no context. And that's basically what I wanted to say. Yeah, I mean, and to pick up on that aspect of, applying the rules to the different sites, right? Like you mentioned that initially that, Croydon is a prototypical application, but you could potentially apply it to other train stations, even within the Croydon network. Which leads to Gatwick, or like in other suburban areas of London. I think like the key, like a lot of the benefits and achievements have already been mentioned, and I think to reiterate one of those is that like you trying to bring, seize the opportunity of rapid urbanization, right? Like as a kind of positive, something that we as architects
can kind of contribute to, like, why we should do a bit of town planning or urban planning, and like also urban design and also architectural prototypes or building typologies like that we can bring to the table, like and I think that part is not sufficiently strongly claimed, right? Like, for example, Patrick mentioned like the parametric urbanism, like which 10 to 15 years ago was happening here. Like, some of those tropes are not adequately utilized, like, for example, scalar gradients or directional gradients and so on. And the other thing is, like, similar to that, like architectural typologies, like you could make a claim to look at like things like the Barbican, like, or like the podium typology that we saw was used throughout, like in Hong Kong, for example, right? Like, initially it is just towers, and then like some towers connect and get a small podium, and eventually, like, when there is increased confidence in the maturity of the city, like you start seeing these mega podiums and so on. Like, I think so these are kind of tentatively stated, like, but you could make much more stronger claims, like, or you could have like organized your project on that basis of making these claims, like, so, for example, like, I mentioned Barbican, but also the Marina City, like the city within a city idea, because all of these are very much important, like when we talk about rapid urbanization, right? Like when we don't have the time for cities to evolve over hundreds of years, like so we need these tools and these architectural types that allow for adaptation, but also has benefits of scale, right? Like, or economy of scale. Like, so in that sense, like your podium, some of these videos begin to show how you can have a template, but at the same time adapt it to context, right? And I've previously mentioned this, like you perhaps needed a Barcelona city block template as well, like not only these towers and podiums, but like something that negotiates between that and like the existing, two-story houses, which probably there's not much to salvage, but like those can be aggregated into like a slightly more residential neighborhood kind of type, right? Like, and we've also previously mentioned people like Peter Barber, and like, they're recuperating like all of these tropes and like building types, like which I think you can utilize, like, and make this fabric a whole lot more intense, more rich, which is your objective, right? Like you want rapid urbanization, but at the same time like a compact footprint, so that we can make intense use of infrastructural investments, intense use of land, and so on. So I think, yeah, very good progress, particularly in the last month or so, like to bring all these disparate conversations and to tie them all together. So I'm quite pleased with that. But like as Patrick mentioned and many others, like there are these criticisms that you should take on board, like, and as
I think
something
it's probably more of to just seeing them as opportunities. I think, let's say, for example, I'm not so clear with language like claim, but I do think it's very important to state the motivation of the project. And, I think Croydon can be interpreted in many different ways. We're talking about the problems of its built manifestation, but culturally there's a lot of things there. I think the way that you interpret the city, I think, is important. If you look at the chess pieces that you've made, it's good to see them as built artifacts, prototypical buildings. But I think it was mentioned in terms of the space in between, but passive space in between doesn't give any agency to people. I think you have to think about the ground condition. You have to start to think about an interior urbanism of these buildings. And I think it was stated in the beginning, in terms of its adaptiveness. If it's over 50 years, it's not going to be a linear growth, or it shouldn't be a linear growth if we're basically arming ourselves with this gamified space that basically allows us to write the rules, reevaluate those rules and look at time, latency, and change as being the fundamental issues that we're talking about in terms of planning. That isn't stated in the project. And that's why I find the language sometimes of claiming it should be more about demonstrating. Demonstrate how change can be basically embedded not only in the planning, but also in the interpretation of that planning model in terms of its architecture. I really do think that there are a lot of people doing generic master plans. The interpretation of that, especially with the data that's available to us today, gives us a certain ability to be able to take that complexity on board. And so I think like gamification is used as a broad subject, and I think you need to be hyper-specific. Like, what kind of city are we talking about? What are the other programs that you want here? When you put little trees in the buildings and this like big, green way that wraps around, these for me become caricatures. These are the kinds of things that are basically tools to somehow speak to an audience of the general public, like somehow we're doing something public. But I think, for example, a swimming pool, a this, a that, other programs that you insert that really start to challenge what we mean by public, by building, by what you mean by commercial. I think like you guys should definitely try to take some of these things and really see them as lived environments. And that's where I think like you start to show some of this like first person experience, but like you mentioned, from the ground, some of these looping elements are interesting, but this plate that these chess pieces are on, to be honest with you, is not interesting for me. I think the street as a car network is not needed here. And I think Homa's point is a very important one. You're building a place, and it should have its own kind of identity. And the transit thing, I think, is something that was a starting point. But as you're thinking about your project and the possibilities of it, as a research, I think you can think about all of the other possibilities as well. That's where all of these different iterations give you added value to reinterpret. This isn't like the final version, but this is the research. If it is so, then I think you can potentially re-look at your work for its opportunities. What are meaningful differences between these master plans? Is this 2.5D architecture really just an envelope condition, or are we really talking about recursively multi-scalar kind of recursions of some of these organizations? And then I think you're going to be doing something interesting and continuing, I think, the legacy, Shajay, that you're talking about, but with new tools that weren't really afforded to us. So that complexity can come through, and that reality of the kind of information that you're using is more legible. Like when we look at this world, it's very familiar, those kind of programmatic, let's call it attentions to three very generic factors of the city. But I think you guys can really speculate a lot more, especially because your architecture demands it. All of that voided, eroded space becomes, I think, really interesting opportunity, but you should give some legibility of use cases that to really take that on board and give that over to people as, plausible kind of scenarios. And that'll allow you to continue to develop the game. Anyway, this is the first presentation. We got another two before lunch, but I think you guys have made good progress, so congratulations.